My friends, have you ever heard of the age-old riddle? There's 104 days of summer vacation, and school comes along just to end it. So the annual problem for our generation is finding a good way to spend it. Beautifully put, if I may say so myself. And the moral of the story is we all love summer, the weather, the events, etc. But eventually, like everything, it comes to an end. But what if it didn't? What if summer started one day and then just continued on forever? Well, turns out we don't have to imagine, because this actually occurred, kind of, as in, instead of forever, it was more like 10 million years of summer. But really, at that point, who's counting? Now, you might be starting to feel a bit jelly at this moment for whoever had the luxury of experiencing never-ending warm and sun, but be careful what you wish for, because this wasn't as paradisey as one might expect, especially seeing that this event went down during a time already kind of dubious to human life. And that was the good old Cretaceous. Now this might confuse some people because the Cretaceous and even the Mesozoic as a whole is known for having been much warmer than the present anyways. But during this event, things got abnormally hot even for the dinosaurs. And this strange episode of time is now referred to as the Cretaceous Thermal Maximum, or as I like to call it, the longest summer in Earth's history. And though you may think the Cretaceous is synonymous with T-Rex, this all actually went down before the Rex was even a thought in evolution's eye, with the beginning of this story taking place about 100 million years ago at the onset of the late Cretaceous. And things were already quite unhinged on the planet. I mean, you had giant theropods like the Spinosaurus and Charonodontosaurus literally living in the exact same environment, while just across the pond, the flipping Giganotosaurus was stomping around in Argentina at the same time. And that's enough teeth for everyone, no doubt. But don't forget that during these times, depending on where you were dropped in, you would have also needed not to worry about supercrocs, megasauropods, giant ornithischians, and then of course the heat, which to us would have felt nigh unbearable, as 100 million years ago the Earth was specifically in the Cenomanian stage, and temperatures were already quite high, with mid-latitude seas cracking 31 degrees Celsius in temperature, or about 88 degrees Fahrenheit. So swimming in the sea would have felt like a nice indoor, slightly heated swimming pool. And in general, global temperatures are about 10 degrees Celsius or 18 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than current temperatures, leading to widespread tropical conditions, sprawling forests, and presumably a lot of bugs. And in the polar region, things were even warmer in a sense, as it was about 17 degrees Celsius or 30 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than current polar conditions. Meaning that, in other words, walking along the beaches of Antarctica would really just felt like taking a stroll in Switzerland. Might sound pretty picturesque, but with this heat also came much more life to Antarctica and the North Pole, meaning your walk could have been interrupted by a few rather unwelcomed faces. Here's the crazy thing though, while unarguably warm, 100 million years ago was just the start. Basically, it was the first day before summer officially began, as something was going on, something big. Yet you could have only felt it, not seen it or touched it, because it was happening in the air. And it had to do with a familiar face, CO2. I know, carbon dioxide seems to pop up everywhere and in every event. But this time, things were very different, as the atmosphere is basically becoming a soup of this stuff. And the reason for this might have been quite strange. Now, normally, you wouldn't expect water to ever be the culprit for a rise in carbon dioxide. But it was in the late Cretaceous, kind of. And there was specifically one body of water to blame, the Atlantic. The Atlantic today is Earth's second largest ocean, stretching 4,830 kilometers or 3,000 miles at its widest point, and being large enough to cover literally 17% of all of Earth's surface. So it's hard to imagine that at one point it was smaller, much smaller. And in fact, 180 million years ago, it didn't even exist. But this all started to change when the supercontinent of Pangaea started to break apart, and the space in between, Europe, North America, Africa, and South America, rifted. And in the space they left behind, water seeped in, creating the Atlantic Ocean. And while the process of its birth was stretched over millions and millions of years, it was still rather violent in a sense, as its opening led to massive surges in earthquakes and underwater volcanism, drastically raising carbon dioxide levels, especially as the Cenomanian was coming to a close.
And that's just the average, and the formation of the Atlantic led to an increase in worldwide sea levels. And when sea levels rise, the amount of land decreases, thus lowering the amount of forests and trees the planet could produce, and therefore causing even higher levels of carbon dioxide. And then on top of all of this, the birth of the ocean also formed a brand new gateway that fundamentally changed the way heat was transported throughout the world. It made the oceans more sluggish, if you will, allowing for greater amounts of heat and carbon dioxide to become trapped, which all eventually had the effect of causing the atmosphere to become a thick soup of this stuff that reached its peak during the Turonian stage, which began roughly 94 million years ago. And so now, at this point, you could say that we had officially endured the most brutal months of summer. Just in this case, the timescale is in weeks, but rather millions of years. And it's estimated that carbon dioxide could have cracked 2,000 parts per million during this time, which sure is just a random number to you, but for context, that is 7 times greater than the levels of pre-industrial carbon dioxide, and really is one of the highest concentrations in Earth's history, leading to the days getting longer. Or at least it would have felt like that because it just got crummy hot. So I'm sure every day felt incredibly drawn out. I mean, we're looking at days where the average temperature seen in mid-latitude seas was about 38 degrees Celsius, or 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's just the average. And this is 14 degrees Celsius higher than current high averages, making this Earth's hottest known point in the last 200 million years. And as a result, even traveling to certain parts of Russia and Canada would present you with tropical conditions, while the poles themselves actually maintained warm-tiered climates. But if you did insist on time traveling back here, I'd recommend that on top of packing a fan to visit most places, and also say you should watch another one of my videos as a bit of a guide. As similar to the Carnian pluvial event, it appears that the Cretaceous Thermal Maximum had impacts on the hydrological system, which in this case resulted in the weather basically amplifying, meaning where it was humid, things just got more wet and rainier, whereas dry areas became even more desolate than before. And something besides weather that was also a lot more extreme during the Turonian was simply geography, as the world was doing some trippy stuff. As briefly mentioned before, the sea levels had risen during this prolonged summer, but I may have been underplaying just how severe the situation really was, as it was in this stage that sea levels possibly reached the highest ever, with water being as high as 300 meters or nearly 1,000 feet more than the present. In other words, over 5 times greater than the height of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And if something like that happened today, the world would look a bit like this, and humanity would be a-hurting. This astronomical difference in sea level, coupled with the position of Earth's tectonic plates, led to what I call fractured Earth, which I don't think is too hard to see when taking a look at this map, with the seas and oceans essentially marooning many parts of Earth and creating various large inland seas that submerged much of the coasts and divided continents. Now, this abundance of warm tropical seas and waters might get you thinking that maybe it's a better idea to man up and just face the dinosaurs of the Turonian. In other words, there ain't no way we should get in the water. But in reality, for a short time during the summer stint, you could actually say the world became slightly safer to be chilling in the water than on land. I know, not the usual. As it turns out that a summer on roids and a bunch of carbon dioxide, along with the changes to the ocean circulations, isn't exactly the best thing for marine life. You may be surprised to hear this, but we might actually have this event to thank for the lack of certain monstrosities in the water, as there were 2 very iconic groups of marine reptiles that had trouble enduring this mega summer. The first group being the Ichthyosaurs, an order of marine reptiles who had been a staple within Mesozoic oceans for hundreds of millions of years, possibly even appearing before the Mesozoic during the Permian. And on average, these creatures were often dolphin-like in appearance, but were obviously not their ancestors, being rather very unrelated reptiles. But like dolphins, they were hugely successful all over the world, expanding in just about every niche possible, while also hitting most size achievements too, with some being tiny and others being on the scale of large whales. Yet science could not save them this time, as the changing climate and oceans led to a monumental fall-off for this order, as the shift in underwater environments proved catastrophic, which was definitely not helped by the fact that the ichthyosaurs were already struggling a bit beforehand, having already hit a plateau in diversity.
And by the end of the summer, a 150 million-year-old reign had ended.
And like I said, they were not the only icons to get permanently erased during these summer days, as another ill-fated group were arguably even more iconic during the later Mesozoic and have been the undisputed apex predators of the oceans, the pliosaurs. Now these guys were essentially living, swimming giant rowboats, except with massive skulls filled with some of the gnarliest teeth you could find on the entire planet. And for millions of years, they had some of the most efficient killers ever seen, being capable of taking out just about anything that they caught, and were in fact so dominating that they even restricted the success of what we now consider the scariest animals in the ocean, sharks. But just like the ichthyosaurs, it seems like too much summer wasn't all too great for the pliosaurs, and they slowly withered as a group, becoming less diverse and smaller until there were simply none left. Possibly a combination of the changing ecosystems and maybe the fact that one of their main food sources, the ichthyosaurus, were obviously going extinct as well. But before you grab your swimsuits and take a jump into these warm waters expecting it to be completely safe, I must warn you, because the Cretaceous Thermal Maximum may have burnt some marine animals, no pun intended, but it failed to faze others. In fact, one group of thalassophobia-inducing creatures may even have this event to thank for their eventual comeback, and that would of course be the sharks I just mentioned. It may be hard to imagine this because of how scary they are now, but at one point, namely before the thermal maximum, this slot hadn't been doing too well, bowing down to not only the pliosaurs, but also others. Yet the long summer lended them a merciful hand, reducing competition and therefore increasing their overall diversity. And unfortunately, it also seems like sharks were seriously hitting the gym at this point too, bulking up to sizes not seen in close to 100 million years before the Cretaceous. And this in turn led to things like the Carchaetobiodon, a type of mackerel shark that prowled the waters near and around Australia, North America, England, and Kazakhstan. And it was probably one of the first sharks to become an apex predator in those days. And fully matured individuals would have reached up to 5.5 meters, or 18 feet in length, similar to a large great white. And not only was it similar in size, it actually kind of looked like one too, possessing a similar body shape, with the main difference being that it had a stubbier head and different teeth, which by the way were still very, very lethal, being razor sharp and robust, which is believed to have allowed it to tackle a range of pliosaurs and other marine reptiles. Ironically though, while swimming into the sky would spell trouble, it wasn't actually the biggest fry around. No, that title went to the Cretaceous, a relatively unknown shark that was actually one of the largest to have ever lived, period. Found within the western interior seaway in various parts of Africa, Europe, and Asia, this fish was also a mackerel shark, albeit one very big mackerel shark, as in some cases it could reach up to 11.28 meters, or 37 feet long, while weighing multiple tons. So at the very least, this thing would have appeared bigger than a whale shark, and it was absolutely meaner than one too, having not only blade-like teeth, but a body plan akin to that of a tiger shark, with the main differentiator besides the overall size being a much larger head, relatively speaking, as well as some absolutely ridiculous jaws, which allowed it to eat other giants, and in some cases armored prey, such as marine turtles that were even found in one specimen's stomach. And actually, speaking of turtles, this seems to be another group that benefited from the thermal maximum, leading to multiple species whose shells alone were longer than the average NBA player. And stepping back into the thalassophobia area once more, we absolutely cannot forget the Clingoryx serena, a legendary menace of the western interior seaway that popped up around this time as well. And then we also have the less scary but more off-putting Aqualamna, which was also a shark, even though, yes, that's hard to believe, seeing those unusual wing-like fins that aided in underwater propulsion. Don't worry too much though, because while coming face to face with one of these guys would surely be shocking, it would not be that interested in you, as it had quite the odd face structure which seemed a much better gulping down plankton than tearing flesh off a mega piranha. Though I do admit that seeing one of these guys would certainly be unsettling and probably bad for my heart. So yeah, overall, while this event did get rid of some thalassophobia-inducing creatures, it did add quite a few new ones. And this, unfortunately, for any scuba divers, was not limited to sharks, as another group that seemingly got a major boost were the mosasaurs. Now these guys need no introduction, being just about the most iconic group of marine reptiles from the entire Cretaceous, and it's actually here that they got their start,
Or at least might have, as in the wake of the ichthyosaurs and pliosaurs taking a monumental beating, the mosasaurs seem to have heavily diversified and radiated, with actually the oldest fossils classified to this family having come straight from the Turonian. But unlike some groups, it wouldn't take these guys a long time to get moving, and during the Cretaceous Thermal Maximum, you would have already needed to watch out for multiple early mosasaurs. Some would have been able to nibble on you, like the tiny Dinosaurs or slightly larger Cabosaurus, but then there are a few that could have actually caused some serious damage, like for example the Tethosaurus, a member that was about as long as a bull shark and had a mouth filled with nasty, nasty teeth. And though it was indeed a mosasaur, you might have mistaken it for an oversized, hungry, strange Komodo dragon given its limbs. Not as if it would really make a difference though in terms of what would happen if you swam into one. However, while this guy was certainly scary, we are still in the minor leagues, so you could say, as there was also the Aegiororosaurus and Sinosanosaurus, two mosasaurs that cracked 3 meters or 10 feet long. And actually, the Aegiororosaurus, based on recent finds, might have even measured a massive 9 meters, or nearly 30 feet, a whole lot of reptile. But before you freak out too much, you can take solace in the fact that it did have quite an agile and slender build compared to later mosasaurs at similar length. Now that said, there was one last guy on the scene that was definitely not slender, and likely the world's earliest dived mosasaur, and that was the Tylosaurus. I know you were not expecting that guy, seeing that we usually think of this thing as living alongside the mosasaurus much later on, but yes, in the western interior seaway, you could have seen this guy during the Turonian. Although while Tylosaurus would one day become one of the largest marine predators of the entire Cretaceous, it did remain of the smaller size during the Turonian, as the earliest species were about 23 feet long as opposed to later ones which might have reached nearly double the size. However, these first Tylosaurs were still much more robust than the Aegiororosaurus, allowing them to hunt a large range of prey, including many things, by the way, which were much larger than us, so watch out. But like I said, while the waters of this time did house some questionable creatures, I'd still have picked it over the land, as green just meant many more problems than blue. For starters, on land, the oppressive heat would have felt a lot more uncomfortable. And then of course, you also had the dinosaurs. Lots and lots of them.
And opposed to the waters, we didn't see that much extinction in dinosaurs or other terrestrial animals during the thermal maximum. Rather, the event just caused more of a shakeup. The shakeup that you could argue made dinosaurs even mightier than previously. To be exact, the increase in temperature and shift in climate led to an overhaul in land environments, with savannas becoming more common while flora seemingly diversified in large parts thanks to the higher levels of CO2. And who likes bigger trees? Simple. Big animals that like to munch on said trees. And what group of animals already has a lot of big plant lovers? Yep, you guessed it, the dinosaurs. And of all the groups, it was of course the sauropods who were the largest. Prior to this monumental summer, sauropods were already doing pretty well, being found across the globe and achieving massive sizes. I mean, just look at the 31-meter or 102-foot-long patio titan that lived in South America during the Aptian stage. It could have weighed up to 57 tons, meaning you could fit over 7 fully grown elephants into just one of them. One! However, things got even crazier after the thermal maximum hit, with sauropod diversity ballooning, especially in latitudes below the equator. And interestingly enough, their average sizes reached a breaking point, perhaps thanks to all the oversized trees, which in turn ultimately gave us what is for now considered the largest dinosaur of all time, and the biggest thing to have ever walked the planet, the Argentinosaurus. Saying this thing would have been a sight for sore eyes is putting it lightly, no pun intended. And given its name, you can tell that it would be in Argentina where you found this behemoth of an animal. For now, it's believed that the adults of this genera could have reached a whopping 80 tons and 36 meters or 118 feet long. And this, my friends, is the estimate based on uncontroversial and substantial evidence, meaning that there are actually higher estimates out there that come from more fragmentary remains. But let me tell you, even at this quote-unquote conservative size, 80 tons is still absolutely absurd. That's like 2 tanks stuffed into one living creature, a creature that has somehow maintained its ability to walk. Or another way to think about it is that the Diplodocus is one of the most famous sauropods ever and obviously a giant, and yet was still such a small fry compared to the Argentinosaurus that you could have fit 6 of them into just one Argentinosaurus. Now imagine a whole herd of them stomping around.
Yeah, it would have been literally insane, and they absolutely had a massive role in actually shaping their ecosystem, just like elephant herds do today, except on a much, much bigger scale. However, ultimately, while the largest, the Argentinosaurus was just one of numerous sauropods that occupied the planet and benefited from the thermal maximum, with multiple being known from Australia, Asia, and others that lived alongside the Argentinosaurus in South America. Yet admittedly, none really came close to rivaling this guy in size, but overall, still a good time to be a sauropod. And like I said, the diversity shot through the roof. But with that said, some bad news tied to this was that their increase in diversity also increased the diversity of what might have eaten sauropods. In other words, theropods, as they too experience an increase in diversity in lower latitudes, resulting in some pretty ferocious faces. I mean, just in Argentina alone, there was not just one but 3 very large theropods that stalked the lands, all being Carcharodontosaurids, a vicious family of theropods with unusually very sharp, highly serrated teeth that could cause catastrophic bleeding and tissue damage. And the 3 defined genera that I'm referring to was the Maposaurus, Meraxus, and Tarvenovator, all being well over 4 tons, and making each of them more than 4 times the size of the maximum recorded polar bear. And that's just the minimum, as the Maposaurus and Tarvenovator could both be closer to 6 tons and measure 12.6 meters or 41 feet long, making them both among the largest theropods ever discovered. And it was these guys that might have been the hunters of the largest animals to ever walk, even possibly in some cases utilizing pack hunting, as there has been some evidence of large Carcharodontosaurids being excavated in multiple numbers. Although even if this was the case, researchers still think that a healthy, fully adult Argentinosaurus was probably too much of a mouthful for any predator. One thing I can say for sure though is that I would not want to be around any of these guys, and by extension, prehistoric Argentina. And that's all before considering the fact that there are still a plethora of other theropods that would have absolutely loved to snack on you. And this included a 6-meter or 20-foot long megaraptor dubbed the Eratosthenon. And by now you should know that this spelled trouble, as this kind of theropod killed in just about the worst way possible, likely skewering prey with her massive frontal claws, and then eating it like a shish kebab. And given its size, it definitely had no problem in lifting up human-sized creatures. To go along with this, abelisaurs seem to be thriving in the area as well, being represented by 3 different kinds, the Taltosaurus, Elocalcia, and Scorpiovenator. And get this, all 3 of these abelisaurs were similar in size to the Megaraptor, being about 20 feet or 6 meters long, but were a bit lighter, coming in at just under 1 ton. And they also, of course, lack those giant arms and claws, instead actually having what looked like sausages for hands. But before you dare laugh at them, keep in mind you do not need arms to be highly lethal, and each possessed a robust, shortened head that is attached to powerful neck muscles and adorned with wrinkled and serrated teeth, which all combined resulted in a very effective bite and hold tactic, which they used to subdue prey, with some studies even suggesting that this family evolved their odd shapes and traits partly due to specializing in hunting sauropods. And they, along with the Carcharodontosaurids, do seem to have been the trendy theropods during the summer stint, being found in most locations even outside of Argentina.
Yet thankfully their size and diversity, just like the sauropods, was a bit lessened once you left the continent, possibly the result of South America's specific latitude. However, what did seem to be missing from the south that was thriving elsewhere was 2 other groups of theropods, strange ones at that, as I am talking about the Therizinosaurans and Novoraptorans. Now, both groups had already long existed by this point, but each experienced a boost of sorts during the Turonian. For the Therizinosaurus, this is mainly reflected through the number of existing genera with multiple kinds living at the same time, including the Nothronicus and Stegnosaurus. It was actually a rather large Therizinosaurus that could crack 4 metric tons, making it a larger than even Allosaurus. But no need to worry too much, as these guys were pretty friendly. Well, at least in the sense that they were herbivores based on the shape of their teeth, and might have instead used their large claws for raking leaves, display, or perhaps defense, but definitely not for hunting. Meanwhile, the Oviraptorans got sizey too, and in a way even more so as opposed to the Therizinosaurus. It was during the Cretaceous Thermal Maximum that we actually got the largest oviraptor of all time, a genus who was aptly named the Gigantoraptor.
Now, this theropod was essentially an oversized ostrich, which you might have run into if you traveled to Turonian Mongolia, which at the time was a mix of very humid forests and floodplains, plus some pockets of more semi-arid environments. And it was here that the Gigantoraptor resided. And what was interesting about this guy is that while it wasn't larger than, say, the Stegosaurus, it was crazily massive for an oviraptor, with the largest specimens measuring 26 feet or 8 meters long and standing 3.5 meters or 11 feet tall at the hip, making them about as tall as a giraffe, but much heftier, weighing about 8 tons. So basically the equivalent of 8 ostriches. And this is super nutty because the next largest of its kind that we know of is literally 35 times smaller. So obviously that vitamin D seemed to be doing something. But then it also leads to the more serious question of what changes when an oviraptor blows up this much. And the answer is, unsurprisingly, diet and lifestyle changes. As of all the kinds of oviraptors, the Gigantoraptor had by far the deepest beak and the sharpest shelves in terms of its dentistry, meaning that it could technically have processed both plant material and meat. And then when you add in the fact that given its large size and therefore high energy needs, it's presumed that this guy would have actually been an omnivore that specifically was more generalistic in nature, eating just about whatever it could take down, moving or not, which played quite well into its environments, seeing that the environments was, like I said, a mix of different biomes, and therefore there could have been many different snacks to choose from. So overall, clearly theropods did quite well for themselves during the thermal maximum, and even tyrannosauroids could be found worldwide, although at this time they did remain mainly small predators for the time being. However, we can't forget that along with saurods and theropods, you also had ornithischians. I mean, these guys were everywhere, and they too were majorly impacted by the new heat and changes the world saw. And what is quite interesting about them is that while theropods did see increased diversity where saurods were found, it was actually with ornithischians that theropods had an even stronger correlation, especially in the northern hemisphere where both groups had massive spikes in the number of species, whereas saurods did weaker up here. In the case of the ornithischians, this resulted in a plethora of new ankylosaurs, ceratopsians, and of course hadrosaurs sprouting up, as Asia in particular seemed to be quite the hotspot, no pun intended. And we see that within the Gigantoraptor's environment and surrounding areas that a multitude of other dinosaurs lived, such as the Bactrosaurus, Gilmoriosaurus, and while in China, multiple ankylosaurians and ceratopsians were found, similar to the situation in North America. And so overall, I think it's pretty safe to say that this extended summer ended up playing a huge role in the evolution of dinosaurs and really life on Earth in general. So the next time that you hope summer never ends, maybe ponder if that's really what you want. Thanks for watching, and until next time on Extinct Zoo.